Hey everybody, welcome to Grow Your Grass Off with Ian from Florida.
And this is Kevin from Nashville, Tennessee.
And I'm Lana from Seattle, Washington.
And I'm Brandon, living in Costa Rica. Special guest here today, Sam, who used to work at Windy Acres in Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome, Sam.
Howdy.
Sam, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, it's time for What's Growing On. Lana, what
yes.
you got?
My little guys, they arrived yesterday. They're 3 days old. This is a speckled Sussex, and I have a lavender Orpington that's downstairs. And so, whew, very cute, very loud. I think I named this little guy Monkey, and my other one's Lav. He looks like a chipmunk, and I wanted to name it Monk, but I'm going to go with Monkey, I think. He won't stop talking. Chirp, 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 chirp. Say hi.
Very cute.
Yeah, that's what I got.
Where do you keep them, man? You have a little lamp for them, or what do you do?
They're in a little bin downstairs by my desk, and then I have a little heat panel that they just sit up against, and then little food and water there for them too. But they're like little babies. Sleep, eat, sleep, eat, sleep, eat. So yeah, that's what I got. What do you got going on?
That's
What'd
great.
you say?
My wife, she heard about your chicks, and she's like, "You can get chicks like any time of the year." And
Yeah.
I'm like, "Well, yeah, you can get them, but then they can't like take out that outdoor time so early, and then you have to keep them inside that much longer before you can put them outside. Where if you get them in, let's say, May or June, you can have them have little day trips outside in the first week, and then and in a few weeks you can have them living outside in the coop.
Yep.
So that's the only drawback for those of y'all who don't know about how chicks. You just got to keep them warm. So you just.
Yeah.
But Lana loves them as pets, so she doesn't mind.
Well, you have to. I've had a few, chicks before, and sometimes they get this poopy butt thing. Do you guys know about that?
Yep, pasty butt.
So what can you do? Is there anything you can do?
Apple cider vinegar.
A little wet, just a warm washcloth, and you just have to wash their butt.
Okay.
It's like a baby.
Just like that.
Like a little baby. But yeah, this little, I got him from a little local grandma and her grandson, and her grandson was really sad and depressed during the virus, and so they started raising chicks. And I went there yesterday, and they had these little guys that were 2 days old. They had 3-week-old ones, 10-week-old ones, and then 4 big coops in the back. So yeah, you can get them kind of. I mean, this is a little bit late in the season, right? But hatcheries have them. Normally hatcheries you have to have like either get 3 or 8, and I didn't want this, so I found these on Craigslist right here, 15 minutes from my house. So
that's cool.
Yep, they're my pets. Sorry, added to my farm, my zoo. But what do you got going on, Kev? Anything?
Not much, just shifting plants, opening up the greenhouse to let it air out, closing it up at night, running the heater sometimes, moving plants in and out of the garage based on whether it's going to be below freezing or not. Just and then I got actually the black soldier fly larva in my basement now, and I'm going to talk about that in the growing for real section.
That's cool. I saw Todd, my neighbor, he showed me his soldier fly setup, so I'm going to try to get a video about in depth on that too.
Please.
Nice.
Let's see it.
Nice.
Ian?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to get those set up because I'll be getting chickens here sooner than later too. Chicken coop, almost done. Got a little bit more. I just got to get the side panels on and get it painted. Then I got about 18-20 yards of free mulch yesterday. So now I'm going to get Forest Section 1 done, Zone 1 around my porch in my backyard. So it's starting to look for real around here. So it's funny what mulch can do.
I'd love to see some photos, what you kind of aerials or something if you can. That'd be cool.
Yeah.
I'll work on it. I have a couple time lapse pictures I've been taking over the last 3 or 4 months. So once I get it all mulched, I'll put it out. But I still probably have 200 plants in pots that are just waiting for their home. So working as fast as I can.
Are they dormant at all? Do you have some that are like kind of in a semi-dormant?
Just apples and peaches, but my peaches are actually flowering right now. So I don't know if they're going to actually set fruit because it's going to get cold here in about a month. So we'll see. I'll try to cover them. I got some frost cloth, so see if I can sneak by. We'll see what happens.
All right.
How about you, Brandon?
Yeah, for me, I worked on kind of finishing up some concrete work, but then I'm also working on this big terraced area. So I got some plants from my neighbor Todd. You know, he went to town and he picked up some cool plants. So I got a cool video I can share. But comfrey, we got some milk vetch, we got some calendula, we got some rosemary, some thyme, a couple of different herbs there, and so we'll be able to kind of add to the mix and share, which is fantastic because we got quite a few different neighbors here in our place that are they're into sharing. So they got a lot of berries and things, and so at the end of the day, we can get cuttings and keep things rolling. Sam has got an amazing amount of experience with growing food in general, but he's kind of really practiced up in terms of doing it on large scale, so big acreage, and then animals and grains. And so we got some topics here that I think will be really interesting as far as diving into organic version of that. What does it take to do it? Maybe some of the myths that people have in their mind conceptually. So we want to try and get down and dirty with that. So, you know, this is what we got for today as far as Sam being the expert. So Sam, please tell us, if you would, what's your background? How did you get to this place where you're at now in terms of, you know, you're running a farm, and this is a big, you know, 100-acre farm or more, right? 200 acres, 300 acres?
It was a 400. We had 422 certified organic acres. And just before we start, I want to make sure everyone knows I'm not an expert in anything. I'm just living and experiencing, and so yeah, I started farming. Actually lived in Seattle, and in 2010 we moved to Tennessee, where I grew up. I grew up on a dairy farm. Dad had retired probably 3 or 4 years earlier, so my parents' land was sitting there. And probably 05, 06, I read Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which seems like, you know, that book really got a lot of people thinking about food, including myself. And so my wife and I decided we wanted to try to grow our own food. So we moved back to my parents' land and just started reading a lot of books, a lot of like Joel Salatin and Jim Garish and you know, folks like that who are really thinking about regenerative farming. And for me back then, it was like grass-fed beef just seemed like the perfect thing, because it just takes sun and rain and grass, produces protein, like super simple system. But within that, you're also, with proper management, with proper rotations, you're making the land healthier. And so that really spoke to me. So started, I don't know, after reading, we actually moved to Nashville for a year because we needed to get housing at my parents' house, and we didn't really have anywhere to live. So in the year in Nashville, I was reading tons of books and moved back to mom and dad's in 2011 and just started raising chickens and cattle and pigs and learning about rotation and learning about how grass grows, and started a business and started, you know, selling meat basically based on, you know, good pasture management. And through that process, I found a farm that was about an hour and a half from us called Windy Acres. And I actually was on a pasture walk, and Alfred Ferris was there, and he was growing organic grains, and I couldn't believe there was someone in Middle Tennessee that was growing certified organic grains. And so I was like, awesome, I need this for my laying hens and for our broilers and for our pigs. Like, it'd be great to have organic feed. So I started buying feed from him, and we developed a relationship. And fast forward probably about 6 or 7 years, my wife and I were looking for our own land, and I struck up a conversation with him about opportunities at Windy Acres. And so 2018, we moved there. And 2019, Alfred was an elderly gentleman. He'd been, organic farming was kind of a second career for him. He bought that farm in the 80s at like in his 60s, or maybe late 50s. And so he was in his upper 80s. In 2019, he got sick, and I was just starting. He was like just starting to teach me about organic grain, about what it takes to grow organic grains. And so I was kind of thrown into the fire. I really knew nothing about grains. My whole like farming experience was really about like good pasture management, and so
Because
that
you grew up on a dairy farm, right?
grew up on the dairy farm. But I will say, growing up on a dairy farm, I wasn't too involved in the dairy farm. I was like wanted to go live in a city somewhere and play sports. And so yeah, Alfred got sick, so I basically had to like run the show, and he was like mentoring me from a hospital bed, basically. But through that experience, everyone in their mind is like, organic is better, and organic can be better. But what I learned is that, because Alfred was this little organic, we call it an organic oasis in the middle of Robertson County, Tennessee, and surrounding him there's all conventional row crop, corn, wheat, soybeans, and so you're always looking at like, what's the neighbor's corn look like and what's our corn look like, and you're sort of like comparing yourself to those models. And in my mind, like, organic was better, hands down. And organic, I think, when it comes to specifically grains, there's much more nuance than like one's good, one's bad. And so that's what I learned through my experience at Windy Acres, like learning how to grow grains. And the big piece of that is that organic grain growers still have to till, because they don't have the tool of an herbicide to kill everything, right? And so when you look at it, like, is a chemical, like is spraying Roundup on your fields better or worse than tilling your fields? And so that question, I don't have a good answer for it. I could say, depending on the year, one might be better than the other, depending on weather and how much soil erosion you get when you till your fields. But so that was a big thing for me. I was like, man, the system that Alfred set up, growing grains, was beautiful. He had this beautiful rotation of like using lots of cover crops and then roller crimping those cover crops, using a perennial pasture with the grain rotation. So it was kind of like grow corn one year, grow soybeans one year, grow small grain one year, and then go back to perennial pastures and graze for a few years.
With nitrogen fixers or things like that.
Yeah. So the cover crops we would use were all very specific to what we wanted to grow. So like with corn, you use a heavy nitrogen fixers. So hairy vetch was big, and then lots of clovers. And then with soybeans, cover crop would usually be cereal rye, and then you put a little bit of nitrogen fixers in there as well, but mostly rye and wheat. And so the rotation was awesome. And in the beginning, I was like, yeah, Alfred's figured this thing out. He worked with the Rodell Institute, like they'd been to the farm, and he was really a pioneer, because he was certified organic by like the mid 90s. And I would say in Tennessee at that time, he was the only one. But you sort of fast forward from the mid 90s to where we are today, and sort of what we've learned about soil biology and how that really feeds the system. You realize that like the tillage that goes into growing organic grains, even with the heavy cover crop usage, you're still taking steps back. And so for me, being like a pasture guy, I was like, I don't want to till. You know, like, how do we stop tilling? And is anyone doing that? So I started diving into YouTube and seeing what was going on in the world of organic grains. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of information out there. But I did find two guys in Indiana. I could find basically all the YouTube videos at that point were two guys in Indiana, one guy named Rick Clark and Dan DeSutter, and they had a little YouTube video, and they were conventional farmers for a long time, and you know their farms were paid off, and so they could play a little bit, and so they started trying to do some no-till, like true no-till organic grains. And I think their journey's probably 5 years old at this time. And so I reached out to those guys just to try to I talked to Dan just to try to pick his brain a little bit. And then I was also looking at Gabe Brown. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of Gabe Brown. He's a farmer in North Dakota, but he's not organic, but he really understands soil biology, and he's he's got like 5,000 acres, so he's growing, you know, he's working a lot of land. But he realized that like tilling is breaking up your soil biology, and so he's just got a lot of good YouTube videos about like he's just no till, you got to never till, you know, and so that really hit home with me, because if you're tilling, you're breaking up that soil biology, and your system's just not going to work for you the way you need it to work. And so through that journey, we started trying no-till, ran into lots of issues with it. One big issue, I'm kind of rambling on here.
No, it's a great story.
Okay.
Love it.
But yeah, one issue with a farm that has been in organic for, you know, coming up, well, it's 25 years, is that you get this weed seed bank that is just plentiful. So you've got lots and lots and lots of weed seeds that are there, because when you go to harvest whatever grain, you know, in Tennessee, there's lots of moisture, lots of weeds grow along with whatever grain you're trying to grow. So you just have a lot of weeds to deal with. And like I would see it after we'd harvest soybeans, you know, you'd just see cockleburs spread all over the field. And it's like those cockleburs can, if you till, you're going to plant those cockleburs. So I knew like, okay, tillage may help us with this a little bit, but still those cockleburs get to the soil and they end up germinating. And so yeah, on our journey, we ran into a lot of issues, and that was the biggest one. Was like, I mean, with organic farming, it's always the biggest one. How do you control weeds, right? You don't have the chemical that's going to kill the weeds, and so cultivation's big. Like organic grain farmers, they have to go over their fields a lot, you know, cultivate as much as you can until, you know, whatever you're growing gets too tall where you can't cultivate it. But yeah, so weed seeds were a big thing. And honestly, I was sort of like, my future vision for Windy Acres was to actually kind of go back to more of a pasture-based system and try to decrease the weed seed bank. And so take a lot of acres out of grain production for a little while to see if that could help us.
So in other words, reset it, let it turn to grass, let the animals run on it.
Yeah. And then, so what we would do in the fall, or like before, sort of like late summer, before weeds went to seed, we'd run like if we couldn't mob graze the weed, like stomp out the weeds, we would bush hog, you know, because you're just trying to you're trying to prevent those seeds from, or those plants from going to seed and having that seed fall on the ground. Which was another hard thing for me coming from a grazing background. I'm like, man, we're like bush hogging our fields in the late summer, which typically from a grazer's perspective, you're trying to stockpile forage for the winter to feed as little hay as possible. But we would have to go through and mow the forage with the weeds to try to decrease the weed seed bank. But so my journey wasn't complete, because we had to leave Windy Acres, which is kind of another story, and that's how I ended up here in Costa Rica. But I just feel like, for me, what I really figured or really observed was like, okay, you have organic systems with grains, but there's very few people that are managing an organic grain system in a really what I would consider a regenerative way. And so to me, that's sort of like the next step, like the Gabe Browns of the world. And Gabe, he consults as well, so he's really spreading the good word about like soil biology and the cycle, to try to help farmers. And I think he consults on like millions of acres, so it's like people are getting the knowledge. But with grain farming, I really think there's a lot of work to be done. And within that, I would talk to some of my neighbors who are conventional farmers and who were cover cropping, but they're using, the conventional fertilizers, the conventional chemicals. But I talked to one of my neighbors, and he'd been no-tilling, like true no-till, because a lot of the chemical guys also no-till because they run into compaction issues. You think you're running super heavy equipment across your fields, and if you're not planting some kind of cover crop to help aerate your soil, you're going to run into compaction. And so even though they say they're no-till, they're still every few years having to turn the soil because of compaction. But so one of my neighbors, he had I think been no-tilling for 15 or 20 years on the same set of land and using cover crops. And he had taken his organic matter from, I think, like 1.5% up to 4%. And that's just a conventional system, but using a true no-till and cover crops. And so to me, I was like, man, that's like, yes, you're putting chemicals on the land. They're like, there's a lot of improvement for him, but just the fact that he's growing organic matter says he's doing a lot of good things, basically. Like versus Windy Acres, looking back through the records of our soil tests, our organic matter has kind of hovered around 2 to 2.5% for 20 years. And so I was like, well, that's where you sort of take some steps forward with cover crops, and then you turn that soil and you're taking some steps backwards.
Well, that gets to the interesting bridge for me, because I think, there's probably a lot of people out there that want to make a shift or change, but yet, it's difficult monetarily because you got to take some risk. If you were to go from conventional into something new, like you said, those other guys could experiment a little bit. But what would you suggest to people? Let's just say if you're, putting that hat on, how would you transition well based on what you've experienced, from, this sort of chemical ridden setup to the new paradigm?
I think it's really hard for farmers because they, like farming is, it's not a get rich quick scheme. And so I think cover crops is the first piece. So it's like, if you can start using cover crops and see their benefit, that's like the first step in the right direction. But honestly, I think it's hard because it's kind of like, are you taking the red pill or are you taking the blue pill? You know what I mean? And so like, what in someone's mind gets them to switch from one pill to the other? You know what I mean? It's really like a frame of mind and how you look at the planet.
Because a lot of this stuff is subsidized so heavily, right, that it wouldn't make sense to, if it weren't, subsidized, what would make sense? What would people do if they couldn't rely on that?
On the subsidies, yeah. So one thing I do feel like subsidies and crop insurance, they do stifle innovation, right? Because they've created this system. And it's kind of like a textbook system. You can flip through the manual and basically do it. And you've got like your co-op or whoever you're getting your fertilizers from and stuff, and it's like they're very dialed into that system. And the subsidies and the crop insurance help prop that system up. And so there's not a lot of like reason to try to change, and like Gabe Brown, actually his story is, I think he had 3 straight years of crop failure and it like made him change. And so change is really difficult. And I think that like the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, they're definitely pushing cover crops and they're like a voice there. to try to work with farmers. But I honestly don't have a good answer for that. I think
It's
it's
tough,
like,
isn't it?
it is tough. And honestly, sometimes you can plant cover crops. This is the other tricky thing with nature, is like you can plant a cover crop on a certain year and not necessarily see a benefit from it right away. It's like you almost have to like really buy in and like say, I know cover crops are going to work, and give it a 5-year trial. And over that 5 years, you're going to see benefit in it. But it's not something that's like, all right, plant a cover crop and all of a sudden your soil test is going to be through the roof on NPK. You know, it's just not a black and white thing. So it's, yeah, change can be tricky.
One thing I was going to bring into this conversation a little bit, if anybody's heard of Masanobu Fukuoka, have you ever heard of him? One Straw Revolution. It was a really good book I read a while back. But basically what he did was he stacked in time, which is kind of what you said as far as when you put your crop in and when you plant. Because if we're really trying to outcompete and, you know, the pressure of these weed seeds and all that, that's what he was really trying to dial. And so he would actually put, I forget what type of grain, he would put in like a clay, like in capsule, and then he'd plant, and then eventually that clay would sort of, you know, disintegrate, and it would like leave the seed in there. And so basically there was no time where there was a ton of space maybe. So it was like he was just trying to outcompete.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
And,
No,
and the timing was really important.
Yeah. I mean, the outcompeting is big. And one thing that I didn't expand my knowledge base enough, but it's like, you know, everyone's like, a weed seed is there to tell you something, right? So like from my observation with Windy Acres is our soil was compact, because just through I think it was 2019, we were coming out of perennial pastures and about to plant a cover crop to go back to corn. And so we disced, I think it was about 30 acres. You know, we're only disking the top like 2 inches. You know, we're not really like tilling. We're just trying to turn that perennial sod to terminate it, basically. And so we disced the field, had it nice and smooth, planted our cover crop, and probably within 2 or 3 days, it poured. Like about 3 days after we got the cover crop in, it poured like really hard, 4 inches of rain in 3 or 4 hours kind of thing. And those raindrops, those big raindrops pounding that soil, compacted the soil. And so it was really interesting for me. And not only that, we had like erosion areas, and that was a big like okay, I got to stop doing this. You know, like this isn't working. But you think like even rain can compact your soil. You know, that kind of heavy rain. And so so like we were dealing with some compaction issues, even with all the cover crop usage. Because like, yeah, you disc your soil and it's nice and fluffy and aerated, right? But like eventually, like if you can get a cover crop in and just have like a nice little drizzle rain, then your cover crop can continue that aeration. But if circumstances go wrong, like a 4-inch rain, then all of a sudden you've got compaction, and how do you break that up? You know?
It seems like a high risk situation because you
It's
got
a high risk.
so many acres. It's like your decisions are magnified. You know what I mean? It's like you get, we're going to do this, but we're going to do it to 100 acres. So, you know, whatever happens is like.
Well, it's like, let's check the weather.
Yeah.
Okay, there's no rain for a week, but like it's, you know, can you get an accurate 2-week forecast? Not really.
Right. Exactly.
That's it. And so it's just sort of like it's a Russian roulette. It's a game you don't want to play. You know, like don't play with that sort of stuff.
Well, what other questions do you guys have? Anything on your mind you want to ask Sam?
Yeah, what brought you there? Did you sell Windy Acres? Is it still going? Is it
Yeah, so I didn't own the land. So basically
Okay.
Mr. Ferris passed away in 2020, and he basically handed his business to me, and I was already running a grass-fed beef operation on the land. So I combined the two. We were growing grain, and Alfred had set up where we cleaned all our seed. And so all the wheat and rye and oats and soybeans, we would clean and then mix that for feed and sell the feed. So I combined those two. And there was and Mr. Ferris he was working with a group called the Agrarian Trust, and they're still around. And they were supposed to, that group was started, I think, in the Northeast, and they could see that farmland today is being sold at really high dollars per acre. And young folks don't have the opportunity to farm. You know, you kind of have to come from wealth, or farms are passed down to kid, you know, through families.
Mhm.
So the agrarian trust, they're buying land. They would fundraise and buy land and then give it back to the commons. So they give it kind of back to the people, and then they give whoever a lifetime lease on the land. I think like England, a lot of lands managed that way in England and Europe. But anyway, so he had been working with them for a few years and trying to, you know, do all the paperwork. And I think the money just got too big. They couldn't fundraise for the project. So we were thinking we'd have a lifetime lease, and then that fell away. And Alfred's kids, they live in the city and they're in their 60s, and, you know, they're sold the land. And so we needed to move on.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there was a lot of unfinished work for me, like stuff I really, in 5 years, I wanted to see where we could go, and I didn't have the chance to do it. So yeah, it was pretty sad. Um, but now we're in Costa Rica and we're starting a new journey.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that too. So, what's your current setup look like, and can you explain maybe the vision you want to create there?
For the Costa Rica
Yeah.
finca, yeah, the farm here,
Mhm.
yeah, we have about it's 4.3 hectares, which is a little under 10 acres, and yeah, so we're not growing any grains here. Yeah, so I'm learning more about permaculture, you know, permaculture design, and working more like growing fruit and vegetables. So we're like in the very beginning stages of trying to figure out what'll grow best at our altitude, and yeah, getting more into like perennial food. And even at Windy Acres, we were thinking about transitioning like 5 acres into more like perennial food forest. So there it would have been more nut trees and berries and stuff like that. So yeah, that's the goal for Costa
You know,
Rica.
one thing we didn't get into in our conversation before is the syntropic. I don't know if you've looked into that much.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know a lot about it, but I do like it's very similar to
Mhm.
cover crops for grains, right? Like cover crops for grains, you're growing this multi-species,
Mhm.
um, um,
Polyculture, in a sense.
annual forages, grasses, whatever, and
Mhm.
then we would roller crimp them down at the right stage of growth, and the roller crimper would actually terminate that plant. So like vetch was a really nice cover crop because it created so much biomass. But then that biomass, those cover crops feed your soil, especially when it's just literally tons and tons of green manure
Mhm.
for whatever crop you're trying to grow. So with syntropic, it's very similar. It's like chop, you know, the Mexican sunflower or
Right,
whatever you
right.
got and lay it on the ground. And so for me, that really resonates because it's
Mhm.
very similar to what we were doing
Mhm.
on a much larger scale. So yeah, it
I've seen it
makes total
useful in the
sense.
tropics, especially because it seems that the soil is usually not that good anyway. So
Hmm.
you need to kind of have the fertility up in the canopy a little bit more. You know, you got to
Yeah.
most of your nutrients kind of are, you know, leach out or they get eroded maybe or
Yeah, leaching here. There's so much rain in Costa Rica. Like, cause we on our farm, we've got really nice black soil, but like as I'm starting to plant things, I haven't soil tested yet. I'd love to soil test, but yeah, there's so much moisture leaching all your
Mhm.
nutrients downstream, and then but there's so much growth. There is the
Yeah.
cycle, but it's not keeping up
Mhm.
with the nutrients
With
you
the mix.
want. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I mean, that's
Very cool.
amazing stuff. What else do you guys have? Anything you want to ask?
Yeah, well, you were saying that, you were thinking about transitioning when you were still at Windy Acres to perennial food forests.
Hmm.
And a lot of the clients I've dealt with have talked about that, and it's something that is becoming a popular idea for a lot of people to transition those more conventional farms into that. And I found the biggest issue, and I mean maybe you can speak to this, is that with grain, even if it's not subsidized in the commodity market and everything like that, it stores easily, and there's a market for it. So if you're growing blueberries and pawpaws, you got to pick them and sell them fresh, and it just requires so much more labor, and
Hmm.
so much more difficult to actually sell them. So you can turn it 5 acres into pawpaws and blueberries and whatever, but can you sell it?
Yeah. Absolutely. The first, the first. I don't know if you guys know Mark Shepard. He's in Wisconsin, and he's what he does is amazing. But I've watched a video with him, and that was my first thought after seeing the video. Was like, okay, how do you make money on all those berries that are sitting there? You know, because someone's got to go pick them and sell them. Yeah, you're exactly right. I will say the one thing that resonated with me with his system was like, okay, he's got pigs, right? So pigs can go harvest the hazelnuts or whatever nuts falling. And that's like makes perfect sense. But yeah, with all the berries and stuff, you do have to switch. Like, okay, are you going to have some kind of pick system, or and then you get into the direct marketing, and not all farmers, especially grain farmers, you know, like they're sitting out on equipment solo all day. Like, you know, it's just like switching your mindset of how you're going to run your farm.
Yeah, and it requires like so much more, help and labor, and it's hard to find. I mean, a lot of farmers say, I can't get anybody to come work. I can't find anybody. So that makes it difficult, for sure. And I had a client that he was farming organically on a 1/4 acre, but he had, like thousands of acres surrounding him that he leased out to farmers that just rotated corn and soy, right? Your standard conventional thing. And he's like, all right, well, how can I transition into this? But I mean, to convert thousands of acres to, let's say market farms, market gardens, perennial food forests, or any sort of model that we all, I think, realize is better in a lot of ways. It's just not practical for that to happen. And I think that, nobody really has a vision on what we can do with those things. I mean, I thought about this a long time ago in the Central Valley of California, where, I used to live next to, where you could have, you do your smaller acreage, farms that still produce about the same revenue or more, but takes up a much smaller footprint. And the rest of it, you like regenerate into like wild forest, wild prairie. And of course, you can have animals graze it or whatnot, but it's kind of like, all right, well, let's, if you look at like Central Valley of California, for instance, I mean, it's just checkerboarded, farms everywhere. Like, what if, a third of that became, wildlife habitat because you're more efficient with the land that you do use to make the money? I'm just, brainstorming. I think this is kind of the big question. And it's great that you're, had experience directly with that kind of production to talk about.
On that note, it just made me think of something. One thing, like with Windy Acres and the heavy cover crops that we used, and because we waited, so the conventional farmer, they've got to get their grains in by, I think it was May 15th, to be able to get crop insurance. Nesting birds, ground birds. So what I noticed is we would wait till our plants were ready to crimp, which was usually later in May, like June. But the amount of life that was in our cover crops from like all the ground nesting birds. So like we had tons and tons of bob whites on the farm. And the reason we had bob whites is because we had an environment conducive for bob whites to survive, right? Whereas the conventional row crop guys, their fields, even if you're cover cropping, you're spraying that early. And so I just noticed there's thousands and thousands of acres in just northern Middle Tennessee, southern Kentucky, of ecosystem loss because of the way we farm. Whereas if you do start, turning those acres back into pasture, and this is where grass-fed beef comes in, and because grass-fed beef, you're just mimicking like what an elk or buffalo or whatever else would have been there 200 years ago. And so like the cattle were crucial, like, so we can still have food, but they can let the greater ecosystem thrive within a food production system. And so, yeah, totally. I resonate with what you're saying. But on the other hand, too, like the system is so set up for grain production, and so, yeah, it's like how do we do grain? If we're gonna do grain production, let's do it right,
Yeah.
But yeah,
have you about Wes Jackson at the Land Institute? They've been for decades now trying to breed perennial grains. to sort of restore the pasture lands, but then to produce like a grain crop. And so they actually,
Yeah.
I guess, finally now have a perennial wheat variety that is available. But I haven't followed up on that in a long time.
Yeah, no, I actually did look. I remember actually looking into a perennial weed because there's a system out of Australia called pasture cropping. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but I think it probably takes a drier climate than we had, but he uses like high stock density sheep to graze whatever perennials there, and then he goes in and plants his grain. And then 5 days later, he comes and hits that perennial again to really stunt it, and his grain can jump up above the perennial. So he's kind of got a no-till system with grazing animals, and he's still growing grain. And so I was trying to think, like, would this work in Tennessee? I think we get too much rain because those perennials just grow so fast when it's May, June. Conditions are perfect for growth. But it's another potential system in the right climate that could work.
Awesome, Sam. Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah.
It's amazing to hear your
Thank
perspective
you.
on this.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And we'll hopefully have you back sometime and see what you're doing here in Costa
I
Rica.
was gonna say,
Yeah.
hopefully we'll have lots of fruit growing.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see what works. It'll
Yeah.
be an experiment here too. I've got plenty of. I got about an acre or so down the hill here that I'm going to try to get going. So we'll be able to share that with everybody too.
Yeah, we need to go check it out.
Yeah, for sure.
That's exciting. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, definitely. It was nice to meet you all.
So now for something to chew on, Ian, your black sapotes.
Black sapote. Yeah. So finally we're ripe. I ordered them about 10 days ago. They took about another 4 or 5 days to ripen. So they have to be pretty soft to the touch. Quite pricey. So I'm glad I have a mature tree. I should have flowers on them next year. And then out of the fruit I got, I have 16 seeds. So that's 16 more seedlings, depending on germination rate, but they're pretty good in my experience, that family of tree. So you'll see a video dropped in right after this with my 4-year-old daughter and I trying it for the first time.
Today we're gonna try some chocolate pudding fruit!
Okay, is that what this is?
Yes.
All right, let's get cutting, right?
Yeah.
So we gotta wait till it gets soft to the touch. Ordered these 10 days ago?
Yes.
A week ago. Took a little while to ripen. See, there's quite a bit of seeds in the middle. All right, Cammy, want to try this? Let me know what it tastes like. You want to try a big piece?
I'm trying some.
Should I?
Yeah.
There you have, folks. It's good. And there you have it.
Is it true to seed, Ian?
We'll find out. I'll let you know. I don't mind experimenting, but she liked it a lot. The larger fruit that we had were a little bit better than the small one. Like I was telling Kevin earlier today, definitely tastes like a bland chocolate pudding for sure. So description is pretty accurate. So it's not going to be that high sugar thing that most kids are used to, but it's definitely a natural good snack. So
Yeah. So the family that those plants are in is the persimmon family. So black sapote, even though it's got the name sapote, it's basically like a subtropical persimmon that, you have to eat super, super ripe and soft, like, Ian was describing, but it turns like black. So it kind of looks like chocolate pudding, but it's not as sweet as other persimmons, right?
right.
And persimmons typically, I don't know if they breed true from seed, but usually seedlings make similar persimmons if they're not crossed with something else. So that's really exciting.
I've got a big tree on the corner of my place that I think is a black sapote. So we'll have to see. It only had one fruit and it didn't ripen up. So I'll have to maybe see this season because it was tangled up in vines, and I kind of went through and cleared it out, and it had a lot of new growth. So we'll see.
Yeah, one of my favorite aesthetic trees too. It's got a nice leaf shape to it.
Cool. All right, we got growing for real, which is today I'm going to talk about my black soldier fly larva, and I'm not sure if anybody can add anything, because I don't think any one of you have actually raised them yet. But the issue, so I don't want to like give a whole big spiel about black soldier fly larvae and how awesome they are, and growing them for chicken and duck feed and whatnot, and converting your compost. It's incredible. That is another video, another show. But the issue with them is they don't like cold weather. So you can grow them all year where you are, Brandon, and mostly Ian where you are.
Mhm.
But so I brought them in the basement, and the basement stays like 50, 60 degrees about, and they generate their own heat. So they're growing great, except that what happens is they go through their life cycle so quickly that if you don't have constant new eggs being laid, you lose your colony. And so in order to get those eggs laid, you have the larva turn into pupa, and then the pupa hatch into flies, and the flies have to breed and then lay the eggs. Well, I started gathering all the pupa because I created a little self-harvesting system down there, and so they turn dark, and I dump them into this little tray that's got like some potting soil in it, and I put it on a heat mat that you use for like plants to keep the heat warm. And I put my finger in there today, and it was nice and toasty. So like definitely nice tropical temperatures in there, even though it's in the basement right now in the middle of cold weather here. And so I'm hoping they'll hatch, and then I'll have, of course, these black soldier flies flying around in the basement, but they don't eat or cause any problems. They only live like 5 days, 10 days, and then they mate and die. So the trick, I'm pretty sure that they're going to hatch. So I'm very excited about it. But the trick is, how am I going to create an environment inexpensively so that the adult flies will actually breed and then lay eggs? Because if they do, then I can keep it going all winter long. And if I have a good colony going, I can make 25-40% of my chicken and duck feed is that, and it's just generated from my food scraps. So it's definitely an advantage to keeping it going. But if I have to spend a lot of electricity or buy an expensive light, I don't know if I'm willing to do that. But I guess that's the issue, is that how can you do that in a winter climate without like some kind of sophisticated setup?
Would it make sense?
Let us know how it goes. I'd like to see photos of like your setup, just to visualize what you've got going on down there. Maybe you can drop that in somewhere in this episode.
Oh yeah, okay. I'll do that. If not,
we'll do a full one on it, full episode.
I might do like a full sort of episode on it or something like that. But it is not real pretty looking. it ain't no fancy stuff.
Nothing's pretty. The pretty chicken coop you get at the beginning is no longer pretty. Yeah. Nothing stays pretty with.
It's real basic. I'm kind of just figured out a little system this year that was just real easy, and works with my system and scope and time and everything, because you can get really complicated with it, of course.
Yeah.
But the thing that I didn't want to do is I didn't want to bring any outside resources to feed them. And that's been very successful this year, and that's what's making me extra, renewed excitement about raising them.
Yeah, motivated.
Would it make sense, Kevin, to have like a cube or something, shape over them so they have kind of a closed environment at all?
Yeah,
that's a good idea. Maybe like you would, those little tents they have for like indoor growing, or something like that. I'm not sure what those are priced at, these days, but that'd be a good idea, and I could have them hatch into that, and so I can contain the heat. They need light too. They need a little bit of humidity, and that's kind of what I'm worried about in the basement in the wintertime, because the heat and everything is gas heat, upstairs, that maybe it's not humid enough, and that would solve that problem as well. So I'll definitely look into that. It's a good idea.
You could easily construct a PVC frame and drop cloth or something like that.
That's what I was thinking. Just make something over top.
Cool.
There's a solution.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, that's the show for today. Can't wait to see everybody next time. Until then, grow your grass off.
Woo. There you have it, folks. It's good.